The courtroom buzzed with the usual low murmur of voices as people waited for their cases to be called. Judge Michael Carter sat at the bench, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. Family court was always emotionally taxing, but after more than 2 decades of service, he had grown adept at compartmentalizing. He could listen to the most heart-wrenching stories of broken families and neglected children without letting his emotions cloud his judgment. Michael was known as one of the most composed judges in the region. He had earned his reputation through years of meticulous work, his rulings guided by fairness and the law. Yet despite his professional success, his personal life was solitary. Divorced and with no children of his own, he poured himself into his work. Outside the courtroom, his life was a quiet routine of early mornings, late nights, and a lingering sense of emptiness he couldn't quite explain. Today, the docket was particularly full, with a string of complex cases involving children in foster care. As the bailiff called the next case, Michael glanced at the file. Harrison, Liam, he read the name again, feeling an inexplicable pause in his breath. A young boy, 12 years old, who had been moved from one foster home to another after his mother's death. His case had recently escalated due to concerns about his current placement. The courtroom doors opened, and a small, wiry boy walked in. His straight, sandy hair was cut short, and he wore an oversized hoodie that seemed to swallow his slender frame. His eyes, sharp and green, held a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Michael noticed the way he walked, confident but guarded, as if ready to defend himself at a moment's notice. Liam sat down at the table with his social worker, glancing around the courtroom with a practiced calmness that didn't quite match his age. It was clear he was no stranger to this environment. He met Michael's gaze briefly before looking away, but that moment was enough to send a ripple of unease through him. There was something familiar in his expression, in the set of his jaw, and in the way his eyes seemed to see right through him. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Michael began, his voice steady. "I understand this case involves your current placement and concerns raised by your social worker. Is that correct?" Liam nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice firm, almost too adult for a boy his age. Michael leaned forward slightly, studying him. Most children in his position were either visibly scared or apathetic, but Liam was different. He didn't flinch under the scrutiny. Instead, he seemed to challenge it, his gaze unwavering. The social worker began outlining the case, explaining that Liam had been removed from his most recent foster home due to neglect. He had been placed in temporary care while the agency searched for a new family. She spoke about Liam's resilience, intelligence, and independence, but also mentioned his tendency to push people away. "He's been through a lot," the social worker said softly, "but he's incredibly strong." Michael listened carefully, but his attention kept drifting back to Liam. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this boy than what was being said. When it was Liam's turn to speak, he surprised everyone. "Your Honor," he said, standing up without waiting to be prompted, "I know people look at me and think I'm just some foster kid who needs saving, but I don't want pity. I just want a chance to be heard." Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on," he said. Liam took a deep breath. "I've been in the system for 3 years. I've lived in places where they only cared about the check they got for taking me in. I've been in homes where I was ignored, where no one even bothered to ask if I did my homework or if I ate dinner. And now, here I am again, being passed around like some package no one wants to keep." His words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet scribbling of the stenographer. Michael felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, empathy maybe, or guilt. "Liam," Michael said carefully, "I can see that you've been through a lot. But I need to ask, what do you want? What outcome are you hoping for today?" Liam hesitated for the first time, his bravado faltering slightly. He looked down at his hands, twisting the hem of his hoodie. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I want to find a place where I belong, a place where someone actually cares." His words struck a nerve deep within Michael. He thought of his own childhood, growing up in a strict household where love was conditional and affection was rare. He had spent his entire adult life chasing stability and success, but now, sitting here, he realized how hollow those achievements felt without someone to share them with. Before he could respond, Liam added almost as an afterthought, "And I came here today because I have questions. Questions I've never been able to ask anyone." Michael tilted his head. "Questions about what?" Liam looked directly at him then, his gaze piercing. "Questions about my mom, and about you." The room seemed to freeze. Michael felt the weight of his stare, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the boy's eyes, a mirror of something buried in his own memory. But before he could process what Liam meant, the social worker intervened. "Your Honor, if I may," she began, clearly trying to steer the conversation back to the case. Michael held up a hand, silencing her. "Mr. Harrison, we'll address all of your concerns, but for now, let's focus on ensuring your safety and well-being. We can revisit the other matters later." Liam nodded, his expression unreadable. He sat down, folding his arms tightly across his chest, but Michael could feel the unspoken words lingering in the air, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. As the hearing continued, Michael found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. Liam's face, his voice, his words, they all stirred something within him. He couldn't explain it, but he knew this case was different. This boy was different. And though he didn't yet understand why, he felt an unshakable certainty that his life was about to change forever. After the hearing, Michael retreated to his chambers. The room, lined with bookshelves and decorated with certificates of achievement, had always been a place of clarity for him. Today, it felt stifling. He paced back and forth, trying to process what had just happened. Could it really be true? He wondered. Could this boy be his? Years ago, long before he became a judge, there had been a woman, Charlotte. She was vibrant and full of life, her laugh infectious, her smile the kind that could light up a room. They had met during his first year practicing law, a time when his career ambitions often overshadowed his personal relationships. Charlotte had been different, though. She challenged him, made him question his rigid sense of priorities. But their relationship had been brief, and circumstances pulled them apart. He hadn't thought about her in years, until now. The bailiff knocked on his door, pulling him out of his reverie. "Your Honor, we're ready to resume." "Thank you," Michael said, straightening his tie and schooling his expression back into its usual calm neutrality. He couldn't let personal speculation interfere with the case. Back in the courtroom, Liam sat with his arms crossed, his posture defensive, but his eyes sharp, watching Michael closely. Michael took his seat and glanced at the notes in front of him. They provided a clinical summary of the boy's life. A young boy who had endured more loss and hardship in his 12 years than most people did in a lifetime. His mother's death, the subsequent string of foster placements, and his struggles to adapt were all laid out in stark detail. But those notes didn't capture the essence of who Liam was, his fierce intelligence, his courage, or the weight of the words he had spoken earlier. Michael cleared his throat and began addressing the court. "Mr. Harrison, before we proceed further, I want to commend you for speaking so honestly earlier. It takes a great deal of strength to advocate for yourself the way you did." Liam raised an eyebrow, as if skeptical of the praise. "I've had to learn how to speak up. Nobody else does it for me." The room fell silent again. Michael was struck by the maturity in his voice, a maturity born not of choice, but of necessity. He glanced at the social worker, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Liam," he continued, his tone softer now, "you mentioned earlier that you had questions about your mother and about me. Would you like to elaborate on that?" The social worker leaned forward, her expression one of caution. "Your Honor, I'm not sure this is—" "It's fine," Liam interrupted, his voice steady. "I'll answer." He sat up straighter, his eyes locking onto Michael's. "My mom used to talk about someone she cared about a long time ago. She didn't say much, but when I saw your name on the court docket, I remembered it. Carter. She used to call you Mike." The air seemed to thicken, every word he spoke wrapping itself around Michael like a vice. His grip on the gavel tightened, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuinely unsure of what to say. "Your mother," he began carefully, "was her name Charlotte?" Liam nodded, his expression unreadable. "Charlotte Harrison. She passed away 3 years ago." The confirmation hit him like a blow. For a moment, he felt as though the courtroom around him had vanished, leaving only the memory of Charlotte and the boy who now sat before him. Could this child truly be his? The timeline matched, but he struggled to reconcile the idea of himself as a father with the reality of his meticulously controlled life. He started, but Liam cut him off. I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just wanted to know it was true. If you were the guy she talked about. If you're... He hesitated, his voice faltering for the first time. If you're my dad. The courtroom was deathly quiet. Even the stenographer had paused, her fingers hovering over the keys as if unwilling to break the silence. Michael drew a deep breath, his thoughts racing. He knew he had to tread carefully. There was no definitive proof, no DNA test, no legal acknowledgement of paternity. But the boy's resemblance to Charlotte, the striking familiarity in his demeanor, and the unmistakable pang in his chest told him this was more than coincidence. Liam, he said, his voice steady but laden with emotion, I don't have an answer for you right now, but I promise you this. I will do everything I can to find the truth. Liam looked at him, his face a mixture of hope and guardedness. Okay, he said simply, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely trust Michael's words. The social worker cleared her throat, breaking the tension. Your Honor, perhaps it would be best to continue this conversation outside of court proceedings. Liam's current placement is the priority here. Michael nodded, though his mind was far from the logistics of Liam's foster situation. He issued an order for a temporary placement review and scheduled a follow-up hearing. As he adjourned the session, he caught one last look from Liam, a look that seemed to say, Don't forget what you promised. As the courtroom emptied, Michael remained seated, staring at the now closed file. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed world felt as though it were teetering on the edge of something unknown.